Hello, this is lecture number 45. This is on the biology of addiction. And what we're going to do here is we're going to divide this up into two parts. We're going to talk more generally about addiction and then focus on the so-called classic drugs of abuse, like heroin, cocaine, for example. And then in another lecture to follow after this, we're going to take a look at alcohol abuse, alcohol addiction, as well as anabolic steroid addiction. So let's begin this by talking about substance abuse and addiction. And I think one of the first things that I try to get across to students is that there are many different substances that we can potentially become addicted to, that we can abuse. And some of them are legal and some of them are illegal. And, you know, one of the major questions in the area of addiction research has been, you know, this whole idea that the brain has changed as a consequence of addiction to a drug. In other words, it's been hijacked. It's been taken over. And secondly, if it has been taken over, how does that really influence the kind of treatments that we use, the strategies that we use? What does the prognosis for recovery look like in addicted individuals, given this knowledge that the brain essentially has been taken over? This has been a major change over the last 10 years in terms of how we view addictions. So again, this whole concept of the hijacked brain, the brain having been taken over, this is really the dominant theme now. It's not just that it's somehow a character defect in an individual, that all you have to do is just say no to a particular substance, that's how you can end your abuse of that substance. No, the brain has actually been taken over. The brain has been hijacked. So again, that's such an important concept here. So addiction, addiction to drugs obviously has physical effects in terms of what is happening in the brain. It also has social effects. It impacts homelessness, crime, violence. It has medical effects in terms of neurotoxicity, other associated disorders like AIDS, for example, cancer. Mental illness. It also has severe economic consequences in terms of an individual's productivity, in terms of their being prone to certain other types of illness, in terms of you know, both short and long-term health care, in terms of risk factors that are associated with accidents, like car accidents, for example. So the implications of all this, of drug abuse, are wide-ranging. And I think that we need at the outset to recognize this. So I asked the question, what is your addiction? You know, I have addictions in my life. I'd like to think that my addictions are legal ones. You know, is your addiction legal or is it illegal? So take a look at some of these different forms of addiction. Certainly, there are people who absolutely love sweet desserts, like the cake that you see here. There are people who absolutely love chocolate. They're addicted to chocolate. There are people who are addicted to certain types of food. What you see there is one of my favorite types. That's Thai food. That is what's called papaya salad, which is absolutely delicious. I love it. There are addictions to you know, many other different types of food, and indeed addictions to coffee. So, you know, when you talk about addiction, there are many, many different things that potentially we can become addicted to, but they don't oftentimes have very severe consequences for us. So again, there's addiction to engaging in sexual behavior. There's addictions that we see in individuals who are, unrelenting in terms of their shopping. They absolutely love to shop all the time. There are people who are addicted to gambling. There are people who are addicted to alcohol, a topic that we will get into in our next lecture. There are people who are addicted to smoking, in spite of the fact that smoking can be so hazardous to your health. There are people who are addicted to using their cell phones, and I oftentimes see this in students as well as family members. Indeed, many different types of addiction. We turn to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, in terms of giving us guidance about substance abuse, and it is defined as a maladaptive pattern of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress. Impairment in behavior, distress in terms of a person's everyday pattern of living. When you see an individual who abuses a substance, oftentimes they recognize it as being harmful to them, but they simply can't stop. They have to continue that pattern of addictive behavior. And addictive substances, almost all of them, whether we're talking about addiction to eating chocolate, or we're talking about addiction to alcohol, or we're talking about addiction to morphine or cocaine, or smoking, regardless of the type of addiction that you look at, addictive substances, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, increase this neurotransmitter in the brain, dopamine, which is that chemical which is very much involved in terms of how we experience pleasure. So dopamine activity in the synapses of a number of brain areas increase when an individual is exposed to an addictive substance. So let's talk about some older research here. This is work that was done by James Olds a number of years ago, in which he found that animals will stimulate many parts of their brain. Here's an animal that has this electrode placed into its brain. Every time it presses this bar, it's getting electrical stimulation to that part of the brain. What Olds found was that animals would absolutely love to do this, depending upon where that electrode was placed in the brain. Indeed, if it was placed in the brain area where there are lots of these dopamine axons, the animal would simply sit there and press the bar all day long, because it was such a pleasurable feeling that was produced. They would rather do this than anything. They would rather do this than eat. They would rather do this than engage in sexual behavior. They would rather do this than drink sugary water. They would simply sit there all day long and press the bar in order to get stimulation to the brain. So this was a very important research, because it really mapped out for the first time what parts of the brain are involved in reward. Now, there are methods for assessing the abuse potential of drugs, and indeed, this is what pharmaceutical companies go through all the time in order to classify drugs in terms of the extent to which they may have abuse potential. This is called drug self-administration. Here, an animal is pressing a bar that will deliver very small amounts by way of this infusion pump, very small amounts of a particular drug into the brain. So the rat is pressing the lever to self-inject a drug. Typically it's done into very discrete areas of the brain. And if we find that the animal increases its rate of bar pressing in order to receive that drug, then we can start to come to the conclusion that that drug is one that has abuse potential. Here is yet another way of assessing this in something that's called conditioned place preference. If we were to take an experimental animal, allow it to explore these two chambers, one you can see is light, the other one is dark. There's a door here in the middle which will allow the animal to go between the two. If you were to do this, if you were to repeatedly administer a drug, let's say when the animal was in this dark compartment, then several days later, you were to test the animal to see where it preferred to go, whether it preferred to go where it got the drug or into this area here, excuse me, where it did not receive the drug. What you would find is that if that drug indeed had abuse potential, the animal would tend to return to the side of this chamber where it got the drug, the side of the chamber where it associated this very, pleasurable feeling with the drug. So indeed, we could take another animal, inject, another drug to the animal, for example, when it was on this side. And then on future occasions, if we found that the animal would spend a lot more time here than on this side, then we would be comfortable in making the conclusion that the drug was one that was producing a pleasurable state, so that the animal tended to return to the side where it received the drug. These are two, really important ways of assessing the abuse potential of drugs. And again, pharmaceutical companies routinely do this. They use these two different techniques in their animal models. When a drug first comes out on the market, it has to go through this testing procedure where we examine its abuse potential. Is this a drug that is one that an organism will want to return to, will want to re-administer? And that's important information for what we call the scheduling of a drug, which we will talk about a little bit further on in this lecture. So the dopamine reward system in the brain, if we were taking a look at that system, the ventral tegmental area that you see right here, the nucleus accumbens that you see right here, okay, and parts of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so these are these areas that are in the red. These are the primary dopamine pathways that are involved in drug abuse. So the circuits that are involved in drug abuse and addiction, this is a very important figure, because one of the things that we're learning about drug abuse is that there's a variety of brain regions that you really have to consider when you develop any kind of a treatment strategy for helping individuals that are suffering from addiction. And the areas that are involved, this area, the prefrontal cortical area and the anterior cingulate area of the brain, these are involved in inhibitory control of behavior. Basic motivational processes are involved here with the orbital frontal cortical area of the brain and the cingulate cortical area that you see right here. Reward and the experience of reward, that is something that is mediated by principally by the nucleus accumbens that you see right here. Memory and learning, primarily the amygdala and the hippocampus. So whenever you think about developing some kind of a treatment for an individual that may be suffering from addiction, you have to make sure that you are addressing all of these brain areas, because you will not have success in terms of treating an individual unless you do. So again, this is one of the more recent things that we've learned about the nature of addiction. So addiction is like any other disease. It's preventable, it's treatable, it's changing our biology, it's changing the brain. If you don't treat it, chances are it's going to last a long time, a lifetime. So, for example, take a look at this figure that you see here. This is of a healthy brain, and you can see in this healthy brain here, in terms of the amount of brain activity that is occurring. Contrast that now with a cocaine abuser and what we would call a diseased brain, where you see reductions that are occurring in terms of what is happening in terms of metabolism of the brain. And again, these colors, dark is related to low metabolism, and the yellowish, reddish, orange areas are high metabolism. So take a look at this now in terms of heart disease. Here's a healthy heart, and again, you're seeing a lot of good metabolism here. But here is a diseased heart, and again, in this diseased heart, take a look at the deficits here. Compare this with what you see here. So indeed, addiction is a lot like, other diseases. When you take a look at what is actually happening in the brain, if you take a look at a cocaine addict, if you take a look at a methamphetamine addict, if you take a look at someone who's hooked on alcohol, someone that's hooked on heroin, take a look at what we call dopamine receptors in the brain. These are the receptors that are responsible for receiving dopamine. In every one of these conditions, okay, those dopamine receptors are decreased by addiction. And again, take a look at these diagrams that you see here. Whenever you see red and that orange and yellow, what that indicates is that there's a lot of dopamine receptors. But this is a normal subject that you see here for these various types of addiction. And this is what you see in the case of an individual who's addicted. And again, a lot fewer dopamine receptors within the brain. If you take a look at relapse rates, drug addiction is very similar to other chronic illnesses. In terms of a drug addiction, you have about a 40 to 60% relapse rate. In terms of type 1 diabetes, it's about 30 to 50%. Hypertension is about 50 to 70%. Asthma, it's about 50 to 70%. So it's about the same, the relapse rates that you see in drug addiction. It's very much related to other chronic illnesses. Now, what recent addiction research has told us is this. One of the things that's happening in the brain in addiction is that your ability, the ability of an addict to produce dopamine receptors, begins to decline. And again, this is a key component of the craving that an individual has for a particular substance. So, in particular, the frontal cortex of the brain, the smart part of the brain, is incapable really of handling these urges. It's being short-circuited, and it's being short-circuited as a consequence of this change that is occurring in terms of these dopamine receptors within the brain. So addiction has to be recognized as this chronic and relapsing brain disorder that is characterized by these incredible compulsive behaviors that you see. Now, this individual here, Nora Volkow, very distinguished researcher in the area of addiction. She's director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the United States, has made major advances in terms of our understanding of the whole addiction process. And she really was one of the first individuals who was out there saying that addiction is a disease, it's not a character defect. So this is an important advance and an important change that has been made in our thinking in terms of the addiction process. She really was one of the first individuals to report that cocaine exposure actually causes damage to the brain and produces mini strokes within the brain. And that was a key advance in this area. So when we take a look at what she and others in the addiction field are saying about the keys to addiction, to understanding addiction, they've really been able to isolate 8 different keys to the whole addiction process. So let's take a look at that. Addictions, first of all, are not voluntary behaviors. Essentially, what is happening in a person is that a very different biological state is being produced. And wanting to continue to use a particular drug becomes compulsive, and it becomes uncontrollable. So again, it's not a voluntary behavior. The brain has been taken over. The brain has been hijacked. The second key is that addicts don't really have a choice. When we take a look at the progression of addiction, initial drug use, that may be voluntary, but then it moves into this involuntary stage, the stage that we refer to as addiction. A casual user has a choice. An addict does not really have a choice. Third key is that it's rare that an addict can say, I'm done, I'm finished, I'm not going to use it anymore. That's simply not realistic. What we do know is that addicts need treatment in order to control their cravings. They need treatment in order to be able to control their compulsions. This is compulsive behavior in which an individual simply does not have control at all over that compulsion. Addiction, without question, involves a brain change. That brain change is converted into certain behavioral changes. There's no question that an addict really likes the feeling that they have from the drugs. They like what the drug is doing to their brain. There's a surge that occurs in dopamine. There's a surge that occurs in terms of these pleasurable feelings. But after a period of time and after more extended use, addicts enter a state in which dopamine is lowered. Dopamine simply is not being produced anywhere near the way it was initially. And for many individuals who become addicts, this is associated with depression. So indeed, you're entering this state in which you are not producing enough dopamine anymore. And also those dopamine receptors are not being produced like they once were. So this is a fundamental change that's occurring in the physiology of the brain. A fifth key is that addicts continue to take drugs, and they do so in order to feel normal. They take a drug initially because it makes them feel good, but over time, what they're trying to do is to return to a state of normalcy, and they need more and more of that drug in order to be able to do so. So, for example, a person who's a heroin addict, they like the high that is produced, but over time, they do it, they take it and take increasing quantities of it in order to avoid sickness, in order to avoid the feeling that you have of withdrawal sickness. So again, you get a fundamental change that's occurring here as that abusive, that substance abuse, that addiction takes place, where you're taking it to produce this very pleasurable state, but then after a period of time, you're simply taking it in order to feel normal, and you need more and more of it in order to produce those kinds of effects. Otherwise, you're going to start feeling sick, and you're going to encounter what we call withdrawal illness or withdrawal sickness. A sixth key is there's a lot of variation in terms of vulnerability to being addicted to a particular substance. Maybe it's due to differences in terms of how the brain is wired. Maybe it's due to the impact that that particular drug is having on the rewiring of the brain. You know, this is one of the mysteries that's involved in terms of understanding the addiction process. There's also, you know, other factors. Some people experience stress differently. Some people are more or less sensitive to various environmental changes or to social context. Let's also not rule out the potential impact that genes may be having in terms of playing a major predisposing role. So indeed, this variation that we see in vulnerability can be due to a lot of different factors. And I think that that's one of the major challenges in this area right now, is to try to tease apart those underlying predisposing factors that may be involved in the extent to which an individual is at risk for developing an addiction. The brain of an addicted person is certainly different from a non-addicted person. Maybe there's some differences initially in terms of the brains of vulnerable people. I mean, why is it that some people can just take this drug and not be impacted by it at all? Why is it that that's the case in terms of other individuals, you know, experiencing the drug for the first time and feeling this unbelievable need to want to continue it? Make no mistake about it. For individuals that do become addicted, it's compulsive behavior. It's uncontrollable in terms of their use of that substance. Most people, lastly, don't understand what it means to be addicted. Your average layperson, I think, doesn't really understand it. The life of an addict has fundamentally changed. There's nothing in their life except drugs. That's the only thing that they are interested in. And some say that addicts, perhaps, you know, they have low self-esteem. Maybe there's some personality factors involved. That may explain some of the initial drug use, but it won't really explain, does not explain continued usage of a particular drug. So those are the 8 real important take-home messages from current research that is going on in the field of behavioral neuroscience in terms of drug addiction. Now, here's a very interesting new development in this area that has been proposed by these 2 individuals, Thomas McClellan, who was the drug czar under in the Obama administration here in the United States, and Gary Mateus, who's an immunologist. And they've been trying to work out addiction vaccines. And this is very intriguing. You know, take a look at this. Here's a blood vessel that you see right here. Here are red blood cells that you see. What we can do is, you know, cocaine ordinarily, cocaine is a small size molecule, and it can pass through the blood vessels into the brain very, very easily. But to create a vaccine, what these scientists have done is they've attached cocaine to a large bacterial molecule, like what you see here. And once you do this, the antibodies produced from that combined bacterial cocaine molecule, they can later bind to new cocaine. So when new cocaine comes into the system, it binds to this large molecule, and it never can pass through the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. This is very intriguing, and indeed is something that's being experimented with now in a variety of different countries, and it holds great hope for the future. So you can actually vaccinate an individual such that they won't become addicted even if they are exposed to cocaine. So what are the basic requirements for scheduling a drug? This is important in all countries. Many countries have a system similar to the way in which it is here in the United States, which is run by our Justice Department, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. Scientists have to be able to document for any particular drug. In order to say that it has abuse potential, it is a drug that they will self-administer. They can discriminate when they're on it, when they're not on it. They have to be able to document tolerance. That is to say, you need more and more of the drug in order to produce the effect. They have to document that there's a withdrawal symptom when the individual goes off of it. That is, they perhaps become more emotional. They have to be able to document dependence. There are two fundamental criteria for dependence. One is physical. Your body becomes incredibly dependent upon that substance. Your cells can't function without it. That's physical dependence. And indeed, the treatment for this initially is detoxification. There's also psychological dependence, which a compulsion keeps drawing you back, and again, to that drug. And the treatment in that case is rehabilitation. Here is what's called the way in which the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration here in the United States, schedules drugs. And they're scheduled as either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And it's really done on the basis of their abuse potential. In other words, is this a drug that an individual will be very attracted to in the future once they are exposed to it? So let's take a look at this. Schedule 1 drugs, that's the highest abuse potential. Things like heroin, LSD, marijuana, psilocybin. For the most part, these are drugs that don't have accepted use. Marijuana, slowly growing into the category of accepted use for individuals for treatment of pain. But for the most part, it's very limited in terms of accepted use. And they're really only used for research purposes. So these are Schedule 1. These have the highest abuse potential. Very easy for individuals to become hooked upon any of these. Schedule 2 also has high abuse potential, things like morphine, PCP, cocaine. There are accepted uses for these, but restrictions. Schedule 3 is medium abuse potential, things like amphetamines, anabolic steroids, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, codeine with aspirin. Again, a lot of accepted uses for these. Schedule 4 drugs, very low abuse potential, things like diazepam, Ambien, Xanax. Again, there are accepted medicinal uses for them. And then Schedule 5, these are the lowest abuse potential. These are things you can buy over the counter, prescription drugs, some of which, for example, contain codeine. But this is, accepted use. So this is how drugs are scheduled then, on the basis of their abuse potential from high to very low. So the principles of effective treatment, it's very complex. Drug abuse is treatable, but no single treatment is really appropriate for everyone. It might include a different combination of things to be effective. Treatment must be for multiple needs. It's not just the drug abuse. There's a lot of other symptoms going on in individuals, personality changes, for example, changes in emotion that also have to be dealt with. And oftentimes, individuals must be in treatment for a very lengthy period of time. Counseling of individuals, both individual counseling as well as in group settings, are the most frequently used therapies now. The principles of effective treatment, certainly medications, antidepressant drugs are important, but usually they're not helpful unless they're also combined with some form of therapy, meaning some form of talk therapy, CBT, for example. It's very typical for addicts to have other mental disorders in addition to their drug abuse problem. Detoxification, we talked about that a little bit. That's really the initial stage of treatment. By itself, it's not going to produce any kind of long-term change in drug usage by an individual. The treatment It doesn't need to be voluntary to be effective. There are occasions where families get involved in making sure that their loved one is entered into a program. And it may be the case that the individual simply does not want to go, and it becomes an involuntary action. Relapse is very frequent, as I noted to you before. Drug usage has to be constantly monitored in individuals that are suffering through a drug addiction. Here's a treatment that actually was developed quite a while ago, but it's the drug that's called Methadone. It's an opiate drug. It's very similar to heroin in terms of its biochemical structure, very similar to morphine, but it's metabolized and it's absorbed very slowly. So these are individuals that do not experience that rush that you see with drugs of abuse like heroin and morphine. So the thought here is that this is something that's going to be less harmful to the individual as opposed to the drug that they are used to abusing. It's going to satisfy some of their cravings and allow them to carry on in their life, and they'll be slowly weaned off of it. Methadone is effective for some individuals, but not all. The most important facts about treatment that you need to be aware of is that the addiction process can go on for a long time. And it's because of the fact that there's profound brain changes that are taking place. So going beyond the initial detoxification becomes crucial. And you cannot stop there. It has to continue on. Treatment has to continue on in terms of various medications, as well as different types of therapy, group therapy, individual therapy. And you have to really be focused on all those different brain areas that we mentioned and all those different behaviors that we talked about in order for a particular treatment to be effective. Once again, this is a long-lasting brain disorder, and thinking that you're going to be able to address that in a short period of time is wishful thinking. You simply cannot. It really requires a number of different levels of treatment in terms of, yes, detoxification, but also medical treatment in terms of hospitalization, treatment in terms of things like CBT and antidepressant drugs, family therapy. It really is something that has to be addressed on a lot of different levels. So drug treatment, the good news, treating individuals that are suffering from drug abuse is much less expensive than putting people in prison. Every $1 that is spent on treatment produces $7 in reduced crime and related costs. So again, treatment is a much better way to go, much less expensive, as opposed to putting an individual in prison. That just never really made sense at all. Savings can exceed costs by about 12 to 1 when healthcare costs are factored in. Reduced interpersonal conflicts, improved workplace productivity, fewer drug-related accidents. These are all positive outcomes, okay, from drug treatment. But again, stay focused on this. Drug treatment is less expensive than imprisonment, and for too long, what we did with individuals that were drug addicts is we put them in jail and we didn't really give them adequate support and treatment. That kind of a strategy is doomed to failure. And indeed, we have to be in a situation where we're really thinking about this being a long-term process that has to be addressed at a number of different levels. The level of the brain, the level of the behavior of the individual, you know, making sure that they're getting involved in terms of you know, addressing all these different brain areas that are potential and behaviors that are being impacted. This can only occur by way of a very sophisticated team approach to drug addiction. So beating drug addiction, it's really a huge societal problem. The good news is that, as you've seen here, the field of behavioral neuroscience is contributing to this in terms of helping us to come up with better treatment strategies, to come up with what is happening in terms of the addiction process so that we can learn more about it. There is hope, and I think that now that we've crossed over this bridge, if you will, that at one time, you know, people were saying that it's, you know, it's all about character problems, they're all about personality problems, so character defects. It's not that. It's about being overwhelmed, our biology being overwhelmed by a particular drug, and that our brain is fundamentally changing as a consequence of that. So in our next lecture, we'll be taking a look at some other types of addiction, namely alcohol addiction and addiction to anabolic steroids.